Hey guys, in this video we're taking a look at Ableton's Collision plugin, which is this little guy right here. So Collision is one of the 3 physical modeling plugins that ships with Ableton Suite. The other 2 are Electric, which is more of an electric piano, and the other one is Tension, which is more to do with strings. And Collision is specifically to do with mallets or things that you can strike, like a vibraphone or a xylophone or stuff like that. All right, before we get into the details of the plugin itself, let's talk about physical modeling at a super high level. So physical modeling is a type of synthesis where instead of generating sounds directly by producing a waveform, for example, you're approximating or simulating the physical properties of instruments or objects in general. So for example, let's say you have a guitar, you would effectively model the shape of the body of the guitar, and then you would also model what happens as the string vibrates when you hit it with a pluck, for example. And you can do this for all kinds of different instruments, like flutes, where you would model a cylinder, or membranes for like a drum head or something. In general, there are kind of 2 properties of a physical model that are the most important. One is the exciter and the other one is the resonator. So the exciter is the thing that actually transfers the physical energy into a vibration, and then the resonator is the thing that takes that vibration and turns it into vibrations in the air, which you can actually hear as sound. For example, if you're hitting a drum, the exciter is the drumstick hitting the membrane, and then the resonator is the body of the drum. So Collision is no different. It's got this kind of simplified model of a mallet hitting all kinds of different body shapes. All right, with that in mind, let's go over the interface here. So if you look at the synth itself, it's composed of a bunch of different tabs at the top and tons of different knobs and buttons and switches. So let's break it down into its bare bones components first so that we can demystify this module a little bit. So like I mentioned, you have the exciter, or in this case, it's called the excitator. I'm not sure why, that might be a synonym, but it doesn't matter. Effectively, you have the thing that generates the excitement at the beginning. In this case, we're modeling a mallet. And then you have a noise component. So you have 2 components that produce that initial burst of energy. You need something to actually take that energy and resonate it so that you can actually hear it. And that's where the resonators come in. So here you have 2 separate resonators, are both stereo. And the resonator models the kind of physical property of the body of the object that is taking that excitement and resonating to produce a sound. So like I mentioned, you have a mallet, which you can turn on and off, and then you have a simulation of a little noise, which goes through a filter. The mallet is basically a stick of wood, and then at the end, it can either be a felt soft material, or it can be kind of a harder plastic material. And you can model the different shapes and types of mallets, as we'll see in a sec here. So let's go over the front panel. So the volume knob here is pretty self-explanatory. It's the overall volume of the mallet excitement. So make sure we're not distorting here. Next to that, you have a noise component, and this is different from this noise here. This is just the noise at which point the impact happens when you hit the mallet on something. So if you bring it all the way down, you get kind of a softer sound. Down here, you have stiffness, which is kind of how hard the mallet is. And next to that, you have color. So it's just the color of the noise itself. And you'll notice that below each of these, there are these 2 sliders, K and V. K is just keyboard, V is velocity. So this allows you to quickly add some keyboard and velocity modulation to whatever parameter these sliders are below. And you'll notice these types of modulation settings across this plugin in general, where normally if you see this K and V below a knob, it just means that you can quickly assign that. Moving on, next to mallet, we have noise, which is the other exciter we have here. So noise is just a white noise burst with a dedicated multimode filter and its own ADSR envelope here. So fairly simple. You have all the different filter types: high pass, low pass, band pass. You can set the frequency and resonance in this by dragging this little dot here, or by setting these values up here. Here we have the volume of the noise. And below the volume, you can assign that to keyboard and velocity. And below this filter graph, we have velocity, keyboard, and envelope modulation of the filter cutoff. And below that, you have a standard ADSR envelope generator, so you can shape it differently. All right, next to the exciter, you have 2 tabs for LFO and MIDI, which are just different ways to add modulation. So I'm gonna skip these for now, and we're gonna jump straight to the resonator just to keep it focused on the actual sound parameters. We have 2 resonators, both stereo, and both can be toggled on and off independently using these little boxes. All right, so let's start off in resonator 1. So on the left here, you have everything to do with pitch and tuning. So fairly self-explanatory. You have semitone, pitch, and fine tune and sense. And then you can tie the tuning of the semitones to the keyboard, which is defaults to 100% where you get equal temperament. If you bring it higher, then you're kind of stretching the tuning. Then you have this little pitch envelope here. Pitch sets the initial pitch value, and time sets the time it takes for it to get to its default value. So you can add little bursts like that. You can start off with a lower value. And then you can assign this the velocity as well. So if you play faster on the keyboard, you start with a higher burst of pitch. Then we get to the actual resonator body parameters, and this is kind of the bread and butter. And again, just to recap, in physical modeling, all you're doing is kind of changing the physical properties of a simulation of an object. So for example, let's say you were modeling like a wooden box or something. Then instead of thinking in the traditional synthesizer sense where you're dealing with filters and oscillators, here you're dealing with shaping the physical properties of the object. So if you had a wooden box, for example, you can change the physical dimensions of it. You can maybe carve a hole in it. You can change the way it reacts to something. You can change the material. And that's generally the way to think about synthesis in a physical modeling sense. Really picture the physical properties of the object. And then the power of having this in a synthesizer world is not so much to try to emulate a physical instrument, which you can definitely do, but the power, in my opinion, is that you can take this to physical limits and extremes of things you wouldn't have in the real world. Like what if you had a 10-foot tall string or something crazy like that. All right, next up, the most important parameter of the resonator is selecting the initial body you want. So again, you have different kinds of things like a beam, which is just a standard beam, like a xylophone. Marimba, which has a little arch carved out underneath the beam. String is just a standard string. Membrane, you can think of like a drum head. A plate is like a metallic plate or sheet. And then you have pipe and tube, which are cylindrical things where pipe has a hole on one end, whereas tube is kind of closed on both ends. Depending on which one you have selected, some of these settings might change slightly, but for the most part, they're all the same. Next to that, you have this little controller that effectively is a trade-off between CPU and sound quality. So if you pick full, you're getting the best sound, but at the cost of some CPU. So you can play around here if your CPU meter is going crazy, but I'm just gonna leave it medium for now. Effectively, this XY pad is just a convenient way to change these two parameters up here, decay and material. As you can see, I can either move the dot or change the values in here. So let's focus on decay first. Decay is just the time that the sound will ring out or that the material kind of vibrates after you release it. So for example, if you remember a vibraphone or a xylophone or something, if you strike the thing with a mallet, you're still going to hear the sound. It's not going to cut off as soon as the mallet lifts up. So to get a natural sound there, you want to get a little bit of decay there. Whereas like if with no decay, it's a bit unrealistic, but if you bring it up, you can kind of find the sweet spot. The other component that has to do with decay is this off decay parameter at the bottom here. And this is related to the note off MIDI message. So when you release a note, this will determine how much of the release will kind of dampen that decay parameter. So if you set it to 100%, then the decay is effectively ignored. And as soon as you let go, it dies completely, which is a very unnatural sound. It's almost as if you hit the mallet and you kind of you put your hand on the membrane or the beam in this case to completely dampen it immediately. And this material slider, which you can change in the vertical direction here, effectively allows you to approximate different kinds of materials like wood, glass, metal. And effectively it works by changing the different ways the frequency spectrum is attenuated. So at low values, you're getting more of a woody kind of rubber sound because the low frequencies are decaying slower. And then at higher values, you get more glass metallic stuff where the high frequencies decay slower. And again, this applies to other things. If you pick marimba, you get the same kinds of parameters here. We can pick a string. For both of these parameters, you have a assignable keyboard and velocity sensitivity. The material property is only valid for these top ones here. The pipe and tube, which are more cylindrical, they get a radius parameter, which just changes the size of the actual cylinder. So that covers the middle section here. Let's move over to the left with these three parameters here. The first one is ratio, and this only applies to membrane and plate, which are kind of the rectangular materials. And ratio just changes the ratio between the X and Y axis. So you're just changing the shape of the material that way. And brightness just changes the frequency content. So at higher levels, the high frequencies are louder and vice versa. And then finally, enharmonics here changes the frequency spectrum of the overtones or the harmonics that are placed above the fundamental. And so by stretching this up, you're stretching the overtones into higher ranges versus bringing it down where you're kind of compressing the overtones lower. And you can assign this property to velocity here. So if you press harder, the enharmonics property changes if you pick a pipe. So for the pipe one, you get this opening parameter. If you remember, a pipe is just a cylinder that has openings of both ends. And opening determines the openness or how big the hole is on one of the sides. So if you set it to 100%, then the pipe is effectively hollow on both ends. And if you set it to 0%, then one of the sides is completely closed. And again, you can assign this to velocity as well. All right, let's move on to this section over here where you can set the listening position and the hit position. So listening, you have left and right because this is a stereo resonator. And you can think of this as almost like having two microphones that you're positioning on the actual object. If you make this 0%, you're effectively moving the listening position or the microphone all the way in the center. And as you increase it to 100%, you're moving it towards the edges of the object. If you pick pipe or tube, these things are irrelevant because the listening position is always going to be in the center. And below that, we have this hit parameter, which functions very similar to the listening position, except instead of setting where the microphone or where you put your ear on the material, it positions where you actually strike the mallet. So for example, let's say you had a snare drum. If you set this to 0%, it's as if you're hitting the snare right in the middle. And as you increase it to 100, you're kind of moving the mallet towards the edge of the snare. Finally, there's this little RD, which stands for random, and you can add some randomization for where the hit happens. So as you increase this value, you can make it so that as you're playing something, it's as if the mallet is kind of bouncing around different positions of where it's hitting the material. All right, moving on over here, we have volume, bleed, and pan, and these are all controls specific to the resonator. So volume just sets the volume of this resonator. Bleed sets how much of the original exciter gets blended in. And then you have pan, which is self-explanatory, so you can move the resonator to the left and right. And then you can assign pan to the keyboard. So as you play higher, you're kind of panning left and right. All right, that basically covers the resonator. Again, we have resonator 2, which is identical, and you can turn it on and off independently here if you want to. And it's worth noting this little tab in the middle, which is a little chain, and this links the two together. So when you're here, any changes you make will actually change both the resonators. And what's cool here is that the resonators have the same parameters, but are independent. So you can pick a pipe, and then here you can pick something completely different. Let's move on to the LFO and MIDI, which we skipped over at the beginning. And these are just ways to add additional modulation to the sound. So LFO gives you access to two different LFOs, which you can toggle independently here. And for each one, you have a set of waveforms, all the standard waves, including some sample and hold. And then next to that, you have a range of how you want to set the frequency. So either in hertz or in beat synced to the DAW with note divisions. Down here, you can set the global depth of the LFO or the modulation amount. Then you can assign velocity to that depth so that as you're playing harder on the keyboard, you get more of an effect. You can change the rate of the LFO, pretty standard, and you can assign the rate to the keyboard. So if you play higher on the key, you get a faster and faster LFO. Retrig allows you to restart the LFO every time you press a key, and offset is just a phase offset, so you can have it start at a different point. And then the way you assign this LFO is you have access to two different destinations, which you can pick in here. And you have a whole slew of things like the mallet stiffness, the noise frequency. And then for both resonators, you have a handful of parameters like pitch, hit. So for example, if I assign the resonator 1 pitch, and then you have another destination with the same exact settings here. LFO2 is identical, so you can turn it on and off. Next to that, you have MIDI, which is very similar, except instead of assigning an LFO, you're assigning different MIDI parameters like pitch bend, mod wheel, and aftertouch, which is how hard you press on the key after you hold it down. And again, for each one, you get access to two different destinations, same as the ones we've seen before, and you can set the amount. So fairly self-explanatory. And finally, we get to the global section. So at the top here, you have this little LED that lights up if the signal is too high because there's a built-in limiter here. Then you have volume, which is your global volume for the whole plugin. Structure allows you to set how the resonators are routed. So you can either have serial or parallel. If you have it in series, then resonator 1 gets mixed to mono and routed through resonator 2. If you have it in parallel, then the mix of the mallet and noise gets fed into both resonator 1 and 2 at the same time. Voices allows you to choose how many voices you want, so you can either have it a mono synth or up to 16. And since physical modeling is pretty demanding on the CPU, if you don't need a lot of voices, you're probably going to want to reduce this number. And then retrig will cut off the decay every time you press another key. And this is another useful thing to save on CPU, so you're not having all these decays being processed. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention is this little copy to 1 and copy to 2 buttons here. And this is useful if you have a certain set of parameters and you want to copy that to the other resonator next to it. You can just push this button and effectively clone the 2 resonators. All right, so that concludes the overview of Collision here. Hopefully you're not as intimidated as the synth as I know I was when I first saw it. So again, don't think of this as a standard synthesizer and approach it in terms of like wave shapes and filters. Think of it as approximating and changing the shapes of physical objects. And the other tip I like to give is don't try to always approximate an exact instrument. So don't go after a xylophone. I mean, you certainly can, but really the power here is when you start taking things to extremes, and don't be afraid to really take values on their extreme ends and add tons of different modulation, and you'll find that you'll create sounds that are very unique that you can't find in other types of synthesis. All right, hopefully you find this interesting. Consider subscribing if you want access to more tutorials like these and other stuff, including hardware gear as well. And I'll see you guys in the next one.